Daily Ascent. I'm Molly Carmel, and this is the podcast I always wish existed. Bite-sized, on the ground, a little spiritual note that can shift your thinking and your outlook on life to make the day a little better and to make us a little more awake, alive, and ascending. So today we're going to talk about one of the hardest and the most healing parts of the spiritual path, forgiveness, and especially being forgiven. Because let's be real, there is no way to go through a big, beautiful, lived life without hurting people we care about. And sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not, but in any case, it can leave a residue of capital SHAME, shame, that keeps us so disconnected from others and from ourselves. And so this is a story about when I stopped running from shame like that, and I told the truth, and I found out what forgiveness is like. And let me tell you something else. I'm sure this will not be my last podcast on making amends, because that is life. And so, like I talked about yesterday, these last 3 years of my business have been dark, 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 dark. I've been in a real dark night of the soul. And there was this one stretch in that darkness that still it actually makes me so nauseous to talk about, but that's the pod. And I was trying to build something new, a big, shiny program that I thought would be like the thing that was going to pull me out of the darkness. And I encountered someone who really promised me the world, came with some references too, so it wasn't completely blind. But wow, did I get swindled. And it was so humiliating. I brought my team in, I made huge promises to them, and then I had to face all of them when it fell apart. I even had to go, like, almost go to court over this. I mean, this was no joke. I was angry, I was heartbroken, and I was so ashamed, so ashamed. And shame is a sneaky little nugget, let me say. This shame really convinced me to retreat. I stopped talking to my team, and especially stopped talking to one of the most beloved people on my team named Liz. If you knew her, to know her is to love her. Everybody knew about this. She knew I'd been swindled, but what nobody on my team really knew was what I didn't say out loud, honestly, was like I pulled away from the team because I felt like after making those promises, I just didn't deserve the team's grace. And, I didn't have any work for them. So what would be the point of talking to them about anything? And listen, I wasn't just retreating, licking my wounds. I'm not made that way. I was digging deep into my soul to understand how I'd gotten into that situation and what kind of vulnerabilities existed in me that made that happen. And I learned a lot. And I needed to look at the parts of me that needed to be like healed. And I had to forgive myself in many ways. And I was also licking my wounds. But as it goes, tide always turns, I began to feel whole again. And I started quietly creating a new program. And this one came from integrity and faith and my ultimate truth. But in that quiet, I realized I hadn't told anybody on my team about it. And especially Liz, who I was really, really close with. And that silence started to ache, and that silence started to turn into shame. What a tangled web we weave. And then I was like, how am I going to move forward with this beautiful life and this beautiful abundance if I'm still carrying this shame? So I did the only thing I know how to do in my spiritual training. And I did the thing I really didn't want to do. And I asked Liz if she would get on a Zoom with me. And then I did the other thing I know how to do, which is just tell the truth. The best version of every story is the truth, my friends. And I told her everything. I told her how humiliated I'd been, how like deeply I regretted disappointing her and making promises I couldn't keep, and how sorry I was for the harm that I caused, and that I hadn't stayed connected because I just didn't feel worthy, and certainly not worthy of her forgiveness. I just felt so terrible. And I then, it wasn't the first time I've had to do something like this. I just sort of like braced for impact because when I was telling the truth, I was like, wow, that's really bad. And Liz has this beautiful presence. I mean, the most beautiful presence. And she just sat really quietly and she said, "Thank you." And then she paused again and she said, "Molly, please forget it. You're forgiven." And then I wept, which is, part of my charm. I'm a big crier. But honestly, it was like this relief. It just was such a reminder that shame can isolate us so much and that truth connects us. And when we tell the truth and when we let ourselves be seen, we open space for forgiveness. It has a room to walk into. And pocket sage for today is like basic black. I mean, if this is not a pocket sage that you have in your circle, you've got to go get her. She's the absolute best. Brene Brown, and she has a billion amazing books. She is a shame researcher, and her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, is like, it's just a must read. If you're nodding your head in this episode, go buy that book. And she writes, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. If you put shame in a petri dish, it needs three things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. If you share your story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame cannot survive. For those of you in the back. Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. If you put your shame in a petri dish, it needs three things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. If you share your story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame cannot survive. That analogy always lands like such a deep breath to me when I can remember it, because what she's saying here is that when we bring our shame into the light, when we risk being seen and rejected and all of those things that shame promises you is going to happen, we also open ourselves up to being forgiven. And that's where healing begins. The shame will never tell you that, by the way. And that Zoom call with Liz reminded me that being forgiven is its own kind of grace, one that humbles us and softens us and at least restores my faith and connection, which is my lifeblood. And listen, forgiveness does not erase what happened. It just restores what's real. And it reminds us that love is bigger than our mistakes and that we're not mistakes. And I think that's the whole point, right? Not to avoid getting it wrong, not to avoid being messy, and sometimes taking people down by accident in our path. But it's just to trust that when we do, repair and forgiveness are possible. So, word of the day, forgiven. And to be forgiven is to exhale after holding your breath for far too long, right? It's that warmth in our chest when someone looks at us and still sees the best in us. And it doesn't mean that we're off the hook. Being forgiven just means that we're back in connection. It means that shame told us that we're lost and love tells us that we're found, right? And love just wants to come back in and hang. And forgiveness is a reminder that no matter how far we think we've fallen, we can always return. So here's our question of the day. Where in your life might you be keeping yourself separate because you feel like you don't deserve forgiveness, when in truth, it just might be waiting for you? So that's our pod for today. If it's resonating, would you please share it with somebody? We all need that reminder that forgiveness is possible and that it's never too late to tell the truth and begin again. And I will see you next time, my friends. Bye.